Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Good to be with you again. First things first, a little bit of housekeeping. I may or may not have overlooked some raised hands in a previous class or two. So, as mentioned in the onset of our study together, if that's the case, feel free to raise your voice to me as well as your hand, and I will try to get to you. So, if that was the case with you as well as those who I've talked to, I apologize, but I'll try to do better, scan a little more thoroughly as we go forward. Either way, it's good to be with you. Anybody in here get a nap this afternoon? Anybody? Yeah, I'm jealous of you. What is it about Sunday afternoon naps in particular, right? I guess most of us don't have the luxury of a midday nap during the week. So a Sunday nap, since we can put it in that time slot, sort of hits a little different. Usually when I get one, it's because I'm sitting down to watch a football game, and maybe the second or third drive of the game, I doze off without knowing it, and I wake up and there's 15 minutes left in the game. The Bucs are down by 20, and life goes on. But I didn't get to do that today, so if you got to do that, I hope that was beneficial for you. But another favorite way of mine to get a nap in is to, if you think it's easy enough to fall asleep during a game that you don't know the outcome of, turn on a movie that you've already seen. And every time I tell myself, I love this movie so much, and I'm going to make it all the way to the end, and then I wake up to a TV screen that says, "Are you still watching?" So I'm jealous if you got one, and if you didn't, then do like me and go to bed early tonight and start your week off right since you didn't get to re-energize this afternoon. With show of hands, let me see how many of you in the room are familiar with Hugh Jackman, the actor. Okay, so most of you, right? I heard Wolverine. Wolverine, that's my favorite character that Hugh Jackman plays. But you may not be like me. You may not like X-Men movies, which is fine. Maybe you like the movie The Prestige, and you're familiar with him in that role, where you think he's the good guy all along, and then it's a really old movie, so by the way, he's bad. That happens. Or maybe you have a different taste altogether. Maybe you like him in Les Mis. You like the 2012 adaptation of the classical work Les Mis. Or maybe you like him in the theater production of Oklahoma from the London Theater. That's not my favorite, but I will tell you that I've seen it due to an elective in college, and he was pretty stinking good in it. But one of my favorite Hugh Jackman movies, and as much flack as I'm going to catch for admitting that I've seen Oklahoma the musical, I'll catch more flack for this, I'm sure, is The Greatest Showman. I love the movie The Greatest Showman. I was hooked before I ever saw it because of the soundtrack. I love the soundtrack to the movie. It's weird, I don't like show tunes, and I don't really like pop music. But when you kind of combine them together, which is in my mind what that soundtrack is, somehow it produced something that I really enjoy. But either way, in the movie The Greatest Showman, Hugh Jackman portrays P.T. Barnum. And the story is of his meager beginnings, of his poor state in life, and then his drive and desire for power and riches and notoriety, and how he accomplishes those things along the way. And unfortunately for P.T. Barnum in this story, which I assume is mostly true, I don't really know, the actions that he takes to achieve these things, they start to eat away at and destroy some of his relationships with family, with his employees, with his friends, so much so that is the title of our class tonight. There's a song in the movie that is titled Never Enough. And the song highlights the fact that he was so blinded by his desire for the gains, as we would put it in the context of this class, in the world around him, that he did not see the pitfalls coming. Fortunately, towards the end of the movie, he kind of gets his priorities back on track, sort of how the preacher is trying to get us to get our priorities back on track as we study Ecclesiastes together. And that's what we're going to look at together tonight. we're starting our look at chapter 6 together, but if you will look in your Bibles, at least in my Bible, when I begin chapter 6, in the column there's not a new heading, there's not a break and a change in subject matter, so to speak. So this is still a continuation of the classes that we had on chapter 5. So without going into detail on any of them, in chapter 5, we looked at being undivided worshipers and the different aspects of that. And then we looked at the Hevel that is produced from a level of greed in our lives and the oppression that we can cause, the evil of the love of money, and the confusing disappointment when these things ultimately don't give us what we think they will. And then the end of chapter 5, although, as I said, there's not a clean break into a different subject matter into chapter 6, we saw this ray of light, sort of as we mentioned before, a positive message at the end of a better way to live. So tonight, in chapter 6, these same themes continue. Some different difficulties and warnings about what our lives will be like if we fall into these same pitfalls. The first one being that we can have a misplaced sense of entitlement. And then some of the heavy hardships that life will deal us if we let these things be our motivating factors in life. And then ultimately that if this is what we are striving for, that we will have an unsatisfied appetite. And then again, we're going to see some questions that we've seen posed previously, and the fact that they're, through these pursuits, still ultimately unanswered. So that's where we're headed tonight. So before we go any further, let's have a prayer and then we'll get started. Father, we come to you again tonight, so thankful for the fact that you love us and you provide for us all the good things that you have given us in this life. We ask that you help us to see them for what they are, to accept them as gifts from you, and to share with others what you have so richly given to us. Father, most of all, we thank you for Jesus and for the sacrifice that he made on our behalf. We thank you for that, we love you for that, and we pray all of these things in his name. Amen. So, as we begin our look at chapter 6, I do think it's important to discuss and we're going to discuss, the downfalls of riches, as we've been doing, and the love, but particularly it's the love of those riches, which we talked about last time we were together, and the drive to obtain them and the things that they allow us to have. But at the end of last class, we sort of took a break from that negative message about loving money and seeking things through oppression of others, and we talked about wealth or power or riches in themselves as in a vacuum. And so what was it that we said about them as they are on a standalone basis? Never satisfied, right? So, and also maybe I worded it improperly, but the fact that having wealth is not in and of itself wrong, right? The fact that there are blessings in this life that we at times are given abundantly, that as long as the pursuit to obtain more and more of them, they are not inherently evil for us to have. We read 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. Again, real quickly, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set up their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. So there are things that having the riches of life, if they are not your main goal, produce. And those things are some certain responsibilities that we have to the world around us because we've been given these things by the hand of God. And I think we can see that played out throughout the biblical text, and here are a few examples of just that. In 1 John 3, chapter 3, verse 17, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? And then Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. And then Proverbs 19 and 17, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. I think it's easy for us at times to read teachings such as this, or the warnings that we see in the book of Ecclesiastes, in this case particularly chapter 5 and chapter 6, and almost skim over them because admittedly it's easy for us to look maybe to our neighbor or to someone else that we work with, or maybe even someone else that we go to church with, and compare what we have to what they have, right? And when we do that, we think that teachings such as these must clearly not be talking about ourselves, because relative to what John Doe has, then this would not apply to me. But I would suggest to you that while it's easy to do that we have to make a concentrated effort not to do that. Because I would be willing to bet that if the majority of us were to look around, the people that we interact with in our lives, or the people who we cross paths with in our lives, in some shape, form, or fashion, there are at least a handful of people who could use our generosity. The generosity with the things that God has blessed us so abundantly with. And at times we seem to be more concerned about feeding our desires of this earth that are bred in the Hevel around us than feeding ours or others' spirits. And the preacher is warning us against this very thing. When we live without the end in sight, or the acknowledgement of the fact of our death, we will trend to living for gain instead of gift. And with those things being said, let's go ahead and read chapter 6 of Ecclesiastes together, and then we will look at it a little bit piece by piece for the remainder of our time. So Ecclesiastes chapter 6, it's only 12 verses. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to the one place. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? So the first portion of that text, the first thing I want us to look at tonight is the sense of entitlement that I believe it is warning us against. Again, verses 1 and 2, there's an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. So here we see another in a long list throughout the book of grievous evils under the sun, this sense of entitlement that we sometimes fall victim to. So I'd like to ask you, do you know anyone who seems to think that all they have is purely from their own ability and their hard work? See a few yeses, a few maybes. I think we do all know people like that. I think we all encounter people who truly believe that everything that they have accomplished in life, whether great or small, is purely from their own intellect, hard work, striving for certain things, which all of those things are fine and good when done properly. But the preacher, in this instance, I believe, is reminding us that the idea that you've accomplished these things completely on your own, that is simply not the case. It's not solely by the sweat of our own brow that we have accumulated whatever it is that we have accumulated in this life, the good blessings that we enjoy. As we know that God is the one who gives the increase. Undoubtedly, we should put effort into our toil, or how else would we enjoy the work that we've been told over and over again so far through the text to enjoy? But we must never come to the conclusion that the things that we have accumulated are solely of our own volition. Again, we see Jesus teaching of not being able to serve two masters, and I believe that's being highlighted here again by the preacher. And like many things that we've talked about together, this is not a new issue. This issue has been around since the dawn of time, as far as I can tell, the dawn of mankind. When the Israelites were settling into the promised land, the Lord warned the people of this very thing. And I think we can see that highlighted in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 14 through 18. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 14 through 18. Then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you, to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. In my mind, this passage points to the truth and the practicality that the words of the preacher which we are reading. And as long as there has been man, gain has been sought instead of accepting the things that we have are gifts from God. I really like this passage from Deuteronomy for two reasons, really. The first is that it point blank tells the children of Israel that I'm the one that gives you this wealth. I'm the one that gives you the ability to have these blessings of abundance in your life. But if for some reason that's not going to sink in, it's preceded by this long list of things that God had done for the people when they were destitute, so to speak, when they had nothing. I led you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the wilderness, who got you past the serpents and scorpions, there was no water, who gave you water from a rock, and so on and so on. Here, the children of Israel are being told plainly, and I think it's a good reminder for us today as well, that not only am I the one that gives you the abundance that you possibly have of things now, being God speaking, but also remember that when you realized you couldn't stand on your own, it was me then as well. And now that you have had some earthly success, don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who ultimately gives you these things. So without question, material abundance is a blessing. But when the desire to obtain it or the things that it can provide us are used incorrectly, I believe as we see written here, it is in fact a grievous evil. Any other thoughts or questions on that for me before? Yeah, Matt. All right. Thank you, Matt. I think that most everybody could hear that, so I'm not going to try to recount all that, but I agree with you 100% on both levels there. Anything else? Don.
Two things that I get from these first two verses, Ryan, that not only all blessings come from God, everything we have comes from God. Secondly, it's not wise to put too much stock or try to hold it too tightly because, as he says in verse 2, it can be here today and gone tomorrow.
Yep. Thank you, Don. So moving on to this next portion of the chapter, particularly verses 3 through 6. We see here that we're being invited to consider the gains of this world and the realities that they bring with them. That ultimately it is futility to strive for gain, much along the lines of what Don and Matt pointed to. So I would ask you to consider this question. Have you ever known anyone who seemingly, as we would say, had it all, but yet was still a very troubled individual for whatever reason? I think that most of us have seen that, if not on a personal level, at least probably in the news of society as a whole. We see people that we would assume to have everything as far as earthly possessions, and their lives are filled with trouble. On a personal note, the first time that I was ever really struck by that, good family friends, children the same age as my parents, so their child was my best friend growing up, one of them. And this man, much like many of the examples that we looked at tonight, came from literally nothing. Absolutely grew up in a home with almost zero possessions, which then gave him this hunger to succeed, and he did just that. He built a very, very successful construction empire, and he went from having nothing and genuine motivations at the beginning to, once he started to obtain more and more, that desire for more pushed the other proper aspects of his life to the side. And in a matter of years, he ruined his relationship with his children and with his wife and with his church family, and probably further than that. Fortunately, in that case, before it was too late, though there was some lasting damage done, things were able to be repaired. He had a turn of heart. He had a repentant heart. But the fact is that the person that I knew as a child that seemed to have more than anyone else that was in my personal world turned out to be the most distraught person that I knew. And I didn't know it, nobody knew it for a long time, but the fact is that was the case. And here in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, to highlight just how extreme this can be, the preacher here paints a pretty bleak picture. And it starts out by saying whether you've fathered hundreds of children and lived, hundreds or thousands of years, which from my research into it was simply just a way to say that you had wealth and status in that time. These are things that were generally associated with being in a prominent position, living what would be considered a good life. That no matter if you had those things or not, if those were your desire, those desires were not satisfied, and the fact that those desires were not satisfied and the longing that left in you, you'd have been better off to never have been born at all, to never have seen the light of this world or breathed the air around us. That someone who had not been born into this world would have that rest that you were actually looking for and not obtaining. And I think we can see similar sentiments expressed throughout the Bible in times of despair, in times of frustration. In Job chapter 3, I believe he says, cursed is the day that I was born. In Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 14, there's a very similar sentiment when Jeremiah is being persecuted. And the preacher here is trying to show us the correct perspective. The preacher is hoping that we will see that this is not the outlook that we need, but if we judge the situations in our lives with the criteria that life ends at death and the pains and pleasures of this life are all that there are, then we will tend to agree with these outlooks. But the reason that we're seeing this topic come up again and again and again throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is because ultimately he's trying to tell us that's not the case. To not get caught up in the Hevel, the vanity, the meaningless around us, but to focus on our relationship with God and what that produces in our day-to-day lives. Any questions or comments on that section? Yeah, Guthrie? Yeah.
State, obviously you should go play the lottery, you should gamble, but people of the world have that attitude. That would fix my life. I think that's exactly what the teaching is here.
Yeah, so Guthrie says that a lot of times you hear people say, if only I could win the lottery, and the effect that I would have on my life for the better. And as Guthrie said, aside from the discussion on gambling and other things, the fact is people thinking that all of a sudden falling into a lap full of riches would affect them for the better overnight, and that's not what's being here. That's what's being warned against here, correct? And I mean, even if we took that and did a case study, I think I saw a special, I don't know, maybe 7-10 years ago, where some absurd number of lottery winners actually go bankrupt and have less than they did when they won it within like 2 or 3 years' time. It's pretty crazy. If you ever want to look that up, there's pretty wild stats in there. But yeah, Guthrie, I think you're exactly right. I think that's what we are being warned against. And the fact is that this next section, verses 7 through 9, start to point at just that we are never satisfied. I came across a quote that said, the money you have gives you freedom, which as we talked about, the good things that the blessings of this life can do. But it's the money that you pursue that enslaves you. The money that you pursue, the desires to get more and more, are what will ruin you. In verses 7, 8, and 9, we see this concept that all the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. It's as if the natural pattern of life where we work so that we can eat, and then we get hungry again, so then we work and then so we can eat, and then we get hungry again, which is a natural part of the creation we are in and things that we are to enjoy. But then we voluntarily go into that cycle in other aspects of our lives as well, whether we intend to or not. And it's a cycle that ultimately will leave us wanting. When I think about the pursuits of this life and wanting more and the cycles that we can get into that we need to break out of, my mind usually drifts to Luke 15 and the story of the prodigal son. Now, it's not an apples for apples comparison, but I think bits and pieces of it are. So I'd like for us to look at some of that right now, and so we can discuss how ultimately this cycle is broken. We're going to read in Luke 15, and we're going to start in verse 11, and we're going to read through a portion of verse 18. And again, this is the story of the prodigal son. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in a reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Stop right there for a moment. Unfortunately, for the son in this parable, and just for clarity's sake, I believe the parable here, the father is God in the story, and the son is the follower who has gone away. We're introduced to him with a longing for more than he already has, which seem to be the comforts of life that the preacher in Ecclesiastes has been telling us to enjoy. It seems that he had all of those things and then began to strive for more. So he asked for his inheritance and set out on his own. And instead of heeding the teachings that he had probably had that are of the same nature that we're seeing here from the preacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, it took a little something else for the prodigal son to break this cycle in his life. Unfortunately for him, it took an aha moment, right? For him, he had to think to himself as he bartered with the pigs that he was feeding for some of their food, that this isn't it. Whatever I've gotten myself into, whatever I've done in life to choose to follow the pursuits of this world to get here, this is not the answer. This is not what I was looking for. And fortunately, we do have the story of the prodigal son. We do have the teachings of Ecclesiastes and many other places in the Bible. Sometimes, however, it still takes us this aha moment to realize that even though we've been being told this, that putting our faith and our passions and our desires into obtaining more riches will ultimately lead to some sort of failure in our lives. At least the prodigal son did have that aha moment, because how sad it would be if that aha moment did not come in time. But if you look at the end of the story, in verse 32, I believe, once he's come home and they've prepared the feast, and the older brother is upset trying to figure out why the brother who has strayed is getting the feast and the royal treatment, so to speak, the very last sentence says, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive, for he was lost and is found. And to me, that language is the language that sometimes we need to hear when we're studying places in the Bible such as chapter 6 of Ecclesiastes, because that's the dire circumstances in which we are being taught about. The wise person does not let the idols of this world capture his heart, and we cannot understand how we were designed to live if we do not, in fact, have a relationship with the designer himself. Yet so many people in this world believe that this ultimate satisfaction comes from more and more and more, but as we are being reminded here yet again, this is not the case. So that takes us to the last 3 verses here in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Ecclesiastes chapter 6, starting in verse 10. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of this vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? The first thing I think about when I read this section of text is it has a familiar ring to it, right? We're now halfway through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we've been seeing questions such as this, following teachings such as this over and over and over again. As we mentioned last time, that alludes to the importance of these teachings and understanding them when we try to live a life following God. And I think what this portion of text, one of the things it's highlighting mainly, is this concept of who ultimately is in control. One of the 3 main things that we talked about we're looking at throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is that though we desire to control the things of this world and manipulate them for our benefit, ultimately that control is not ours to be had. No matter how much we would like to control things, the world that we live in is the way that God designed it, and it's the way it's going to be. And there is no changing that. And attempting to do so is an act in futility. Again, if we want to question the way that things in the world work around us, we can go and read Job for a proper perspective on how that conversation will ultimately work out. But here, in the middle of Ecclesiastes, we see some lingering questions arise again. What is good for man, and what will come after him, and that these things are not yet known. I read a commentator, a gentleman named Tommy Nelson. He sort of expressed it in this way: when we are looking for control and looking for the answer of these questions, although we may not be able to grasp the answer, it says, are we smart enough to even understand him, being God, if he told us? You and I who don't know how to program a VCR, this is obviously a little outdated, and you and I who don't remember what we had for breakfast 2 weeks ago. Clearly pointing to the fact that although we want that control and we think we have the answers at times, that who are we to try to establish those things? And I think it's particularly interesting for us today. As I said, it applies to everyone of all time, but clearly there are going to be some portions of things that apply differently throughout the ages, at least to how they come about. And we live in a culture that has elevated the individual almost to a mini God of their own, and that their truth, their reality, is one that is determined by them personally. In the society that we live in, the normal thing to do is to be tolerant of whatever reality and truth that those around us have deemed to be correct for them. And being believers in Christ, followers of God, oftentimes, because we choose to heed the words of books such as Ecclesiastes, to realize that the truths of this world are exactly what God has put in place and that we are to live inside of, that we are intolerant and ignorant compared to the rest of the world around us. But the teacher, I believe in Ecclesiastes, is telling us that God has made everything and knows what will bring humans genuine happiness. Happiness does not come from the toys below the sun, but from relationship with a loving God above it. I came across one other interesting quote. I believe it was from Rudyard Kipling. And he said, speaking of riches, position, and pride, someday you will meet a man who cares for none of these things. Then you will know how poor you are. And I really like that sentiment. I really like the essence that that phrase and quote carries with it, because what it reminds me of personally, not only the teachings here in Ecclesiastes and how that points to living a similar life, but if the people of the world can see someone who doesn't live for riches, position, or pride and see how truly poor they are in comparison to that person, then if we can live the words of Ecclesiastes 6, if we can have said about us what Rudyard Kipling said about meeting an individual such as that, then certainly the people who make that observation about us will want to know why. Want to know why we're different than everybody else. And so we could use the teachings of the preacher here when we're asked how we fit into that category to point someone else to the foot of the cross. And that's what I think living the words in Ecclesiastes chapter 6 will ultimately help us do. Wednesday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, we're going to look at chapter 7, verses 1 through 25. There's probably another two-parter. So that's what we will be doing the next time we're together. Again, I appreciate you being here, and I will see you then.